Welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to do a tutorial on how to use your Oxi One sequencer with your modular synthesizer. And it's something a lot of people have asked over the last year or two for me to explain in more detail. And so today's video is for you. We're going to go into how it works, how you get it configured, how you get it connected to your modular, and we are going to show you some tips and tricks along the way. So let's get started. First, we need to understand how the Oxi One maps the internal sequencers to the CV and gate output. So let's take a look at how this setup works. First of all, let's take a look at the back of the Oxi One here, which I'll just hold up for the camera to see. And you can see we've got 8 CV outputs and 8 gate outputs. Now, the nice thing is there's also the Oxi pipe module here, which duplicates the CV and gate outputs using a HDMI 2 cable. I have one here that I got off Amazon. You have to use a HDMI 2 cable. It just plugs in like that and then plugs in like this. And now these outputs here are copied over there, which just makes patching a little easier. Then to access the mapping page, we have to go Shift and press the LFO button, which brings us to the CV gate page. The top 4 rows correspond to each of the 4 sequencers, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if I tap this square here, that's mapping CV output 1, because the first column is for CV1, and I'm mapping it to sequencer 1. Similarly, I could map sequencer 2 to CV output 1, 3, or 4. So there you go. It's very straightforward to figure out which sequencer goes to which CV. The bottom 4 rows allow you to choose the type of output for the CV. So what type of voltage is it going to output? By default, the one at the top here is selected, which gives volt per octave output. Then we could select a velocity output. All of the notes in the sequencer have a velocity, and in this way we're able to output that velocity as a control voltage. We're going to play around with that in patches later. You can also output a trigger envelope. The last type, which we'll look at in the video today, is modulation. So you can send the modulation lanes or LFOs out, the CV outputs, as modulation sources. So this actually gives you additional LFOs to send around your patch, and we'll look at that later as well. Similarly, over on the gate side, same concept applies. First row, gate 1 goes to sequencer 1. And again, the gate types are down on this bottom 4 rows here. So standard gate is just the trigger gate. We can send out a clock, which we could set to different divisions of the master clock. The third type is an accent, which if we look here on the screen, you set a threshold. And if the velocity goes over that threshold, it'll send out an accent gate. And the final one is a threshold tied to a modulation source. So if that modulation source goes over that value, in this case, it's set to LFO1, will generate a gate. Typically, if you just want to send out a series of notes and gates to trigger an envelope, you'll probably have something set up like this. So each sequencer generating a different output on CVs 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's look at our first basic sequencer setup. I'll just patch my clock output here to a inputs on the PAMS Pro workout so I can get clocks and LFOs synced to my master clock. We'll start with sequencer 1, which you see if I go Shift and press the sequencer, it's in mono mode. So this is a mono sequencer, and I have it set to a minor scale, and I programmed in a few notes here on the sequencer. So if I hit play, sequencer plays. But how do I get these notes out to play a voice on my modular here? And we'll use twin waves for this example because this allows us to do a lot of fun things with modulation as well. So remember, we go back into our CV gate page and we're on sequencer 1. So I want CV1 to be the pitch and I want gate 1 to be the gate. So let's go ahead and start patching. Now remember, the Oxi One has this pipe module, which is just a copy of what's here. So I'm just going to use this for keeping the cables neat and tidy. But of course, you could do the exact same thing by patching in the back right here. Nothing changes. Let's get our basic patch going. We'll patch the gate output here into an envelope generator here in Carve. And Carve is useful because it has both an envelope generator and a VCA in each channel. There's 4 channels here. We can take the output of the VCA and we'll patch it into, say, channel 7 here on the mixer. We'll take the CV using this green cable here, patch that into the volt per octave here on twin waves. And then we'll just take the output of oscillator 1 here on twin waves, patch that into the VCA over here, just adjust the envelope there, and let's take a listen. Okay, now I'll just hit play on the sequencer. And we have got a very basic mono patch running. I've just got this on an additive oscillator mode here on twin waves. Of course, now We can just play around with the envelope, but that's not very interesting. I mean, it's just going to sound the same every time we play it. What else can we do to make this interesting? Well, let's use the velocity of each note to modulate the release time on the envelope here, because Carve has an attack and release modulation input per channel. So we will use CV output 2, and I'm going to patch CV2 here into the release time on Carve. In the sequencer, in the Oxi One, if you press the notes, you'll see each of them have a slightly different velocity here. 82, 84, 75, and so on. And you can adjust the global velocity using this knob. How do we map that to a CV output? We just go over here into the CV gate page. CV output 2, we're choosing sequencer 1, so we press that, but we come down here to the second row of the type to choose a different type of output, and we choose velocity. So instead of sending pitch information, we are sending velocity information. Now the envelope's a bit long there on the release, so let's just shorten it down. And now you can hear we're articulating. And if I can adjust the velocity down, we get a pluckier sound. And I can go in here and then make this much longer. Okay, now we've begun to experiment with our CVs for modulation. What else can we modulate with CV? Let's modulate the wave shape of the twin waves oscillator over here. It has this jack here which allows us to modulate wave shape. So I'm just going to patch CV output 3 into this jack here. And what I'm going to do is show you how to map one of the internal modulation sources to modulate that wave shape. And let's use an LFO. For each sequencer on the Oxi One, you have two LFOs, LFO1 and LFO2. Let's take LFO1 and we'll turn it into just a simple triangle wave, and we'll have it at the rate of a bar. There we go. So for each bar, it'll go through one cycle. I've set the amount to 100 to give it its maximum output. I can use this attenuator to attenuate that if I wanted to reduce it, or I could just reduce the amount here if I wanted to. Now let's go into the CV gate page and see how we map that. Again, we're on sequencer 1, so we press this button and we go down to the bottom pad here to choose the modulation source as the output. Now CV3 is going to output the value of that LFO. What's even better is, if you look here on the pads, it's a little hard to see because of the lights on my video. These will light up to correspond to the value being outputted. So blue is positive and red being negative. You'll see the gate also trigger here real quick. You can see the LFO going up and down, up and down. Of course, I can go back into the LFO, maybe slow it down. We can change the wave shape here. So we get a slightly different sound. You more noticeably hear the wave shaping. Now, what if I wanted that LFO to also go negative? Because if you see here, right now, the LFO is also going positive. It's only going positive, I should say, from 0 to 5 volts. Well, here we can adjust the offset amount. And what this does is offsets the value being generated by that CV output by an amount. And so what I'm going to do is offset this by minus 100. Now, the hardware on the Oxi One limits you to minus 3 volts as the lowest voltage you can output, and it only has an 8-volt range, so we're going to get minus 3 to plus 5 volts. And you see here, now we're going negative, and then we go positive. And now you hear a greater range of modulation over here. It's a supersaw stats that gives us a better idea of what we're doing. Okay, what about filtering? Let's take a look at what we can do with that. So let's take the output of the VCA into a filter here. We'll use Ikarie, which is a nice stereo filter. There's a little bit of delay and reverb now on that channel from Ghost. So we might want to go ahead and modulate that. And let's modulate that with a stepped random source of modulation. So we'll take CV4 and we're going to patch that into the volt per octave input here. CV4, again, we're going to make it be an LFO source. This time we'll use LFO2, and we will again offset it so it goes negative. Now we go back over to LFO2, and I'm going to choose sample and hold, and we'll make that go, say, 3/4 of a bar. Increase the amount. Now let's listen. Now, I've changed things up a little bit to use the Pizza and Ikarie oscillator and filter over here. Now, it's the same setup as we had previously. I just swapped out twin waves for Pizza. And what I've done now is I've got Pizza set up with a very basic, simple sort of FM sound on it here. So we can get into all those crazy FM places that you associate with an FM voice. And Pizza does really well under modulation. So what we've taken is some of the modulation that I had previously into the filter, and we're still using the envelope. This time it's just going into the VCA and Ikarie. So pretty much still the same concept of a mono patch, because I want to show a few new things that you can do. But before we do anything, I want to add drums. So let's talk about how we sequence modular drums using CV and gate from the Oxi One. For this, I'm going to use Sequencer 4. Sequencer 4 is in multitrack mode, and multitrack mode is ideal for sequencing drums. I've laid out a pretty basic drum pattern here on the bottom 3 tracks, 1, 2, and 3. Let's look at how we map those to the gate outputs to trigger the drums over here on the LXR. Go into the CV gate page, and you see here I have these pads illuminated. What I've done is these will map for Sequencer 4. Remember, this is Sequencer 4. Gate 8, 7, and 6 to tracks 1, 2, and 3. You see here it says 3. And that corresponds, if I go back into the sequencer, you count from the bottom 1, 2, and 3. So track 1 is my kick. CV gate over here is on gate 8. So let's patch that into the kick. There's gate 8 into the kick, which in this case is drum 1. Okay, we have a gate. Now track 2 is coming at gate 7, and that's my closed hat. And track 3 is coming at gate 6 there, and that's going to be my snare. Nice. So now we have our kick drum and drum pattern laid in. And notice now Sequencer 1 is still doing all the kind of the mono sequencing here, but Sequencer 4 is now doing the drum sequencing. But what is Sequencer 4 really doing? What it's doing is it's generating gates. And if it's generating gates, or in this case triggers, we could use that to trigger something else. For example, let's use track 4 here to trigger an envelope over on Carve to modulate Pizza. And this shows you that you're not limited to using a multi-track sequencer just to trigger drums. You can use it to trigger anything you want in your patch. I'm going to patch gate output 5 here into this input here to trigger this 4th channel envelope on Carve. I'm going to patch that into the FM index here. And then we'll go in and we'll punch in, say, a trigger here on the 4th track on the Sequencer 4. Let's go over to the CV gate page. We go in, we'll map gate output to track 4. Now we turn up the... Now you hear when the envelope is triggered. Every time we hit here. Now, of course, the Oxi One gives you a lot of flexibility. So if I press 4 and here, to adjust this track, I can set the time division to be a bit slower. So now it hits on different notes, and I can set that track to be a different length, say 14 steps. So now our trigger will never land quite in the same way. Now let's look at how we can use the velocity of the drum notes to modulate the drum sound. So we've already looked at how we can use velocity to, for example, modulate an envelope to articulate the envelope for a mono sequencer. How would that work for drum sounds? Well, let's go ahead and patch CV5 output here into the CV1 input here on LXOR. And what I've done is I've mapped the LXOR CV1 input to be the decay amount for the kick drum. Now, how do I turn around and say, okay, so the velocity of these kick drum triggers, how do I make them go out CV5? Well, again, we go over to CV5 and we go down to our sequencer 4 because that's where our drums are. So now we've chosen to map the output CV5 to sequencer 4. And here we say it's velocity. But for which track? Because I could choose all one of 8 tracks. It's track 1. And I could use this to change the velocity output. And now the velocity of the kick drums changes. You see, the more I make the velocity, the longer the decay on the kick is. Gives that lovely effect. Now let's look at how to use chord mode to use the CV and gate outputs to sequence a polyphonic modular voice. And in this case, I'm going to use the noise out warp. Normally I sequence this over MIDI, but for this video, we're going to just sequence it over the volt per octave inputs with a trigger input. And I'm also going to layer in twin waves, going through this new filter I have called Favorite Avocado Toast from Crazy Chicken Modular. It's a wonderful distorting, raw, rough analog filter. I'll do a video on this at a later date, but for now, this is going to be just some fun to play with. Okay, now let's patch in the volt per octave. So we'll just patch in each of them in turn here. That's the first one. I have sequencer 2 set up in chord mode. So now I'm going to be able to play chords either by sequencing them or playing them on the keyboard. But how do I map those chords to the outputs we have here? Well, we go into our CV gate page. We go down to sequencer 2 and we look at, we have CV outputs 3, 4, and 5. So we go over to 3, 4, and 5. And select them to sequencer 2, voice 1, 2, and 3, because it's a chord generator, it can have multiple voices. And we have gate number 2. So again, sequencer 2, gate 2. Now when I hit play, I've got some chords programmed in here in a sequence. And we've got this very basic chord sounding voice going on now. Okay, that's not exactly very exciting. Let's do the same as we did with the previous examples with the mono sequencer. Let's get a bit of modulation going on here. So we're going to modulate the warp parameter here. And I want to modulate that using the LFO here. And that will in effect open and close the filter. That's how I have that mapped over there on the warp oscillator. So what have we got? This blue cable is coming out of CV6 for sequencer 2. So we go over to number 6 and then we go down here and we're going to change that to be LFO1. So sequencer 2 is coming out of CV6 and it's sending LFO1. Now if we go into LFO1, I turn it off, we can't hear it. And I have it on a fall wave. We could speed it up a little. Now we get that kind of squelchy filter that I want. Now we could change chords using the arranger there. Lovely. Now I've got sequencer 1 set up to sequence the twin waves. So let's bring that in as well. And I've got sequencer 1 harmonized to sequencer 2. When I change here, I can bring in a different sequence on sequencer 1. And we bring in a little bit of delay and reverb out of Ghost. Let's bring in a little bit of rhythmic pieces. the favorite avocado toast, the drive. It's really nice distortion. Polyphonic sequencers are pretty much the same as chord sequencers. I just created a different sequence here in sequencer 2, and I have it in polyphonic mode. And if we go into the CV gate page, you can see that I've still got the same mapping of triggers and the CV outputs to the sequencer voices. So voice 1, 2, and 3 are here. And here's just something I programmed in randomly. And so the idea is the same. Basically, you're just mapping the various voices that you want to send to the different outputs. Now, one of the challenges you face with a modular setup is trying to get all your oscillators in tune. Even if they're digital oscillators and hold their tuning, you can still find yourself tweaking everything just to get it set up. Now, the Oxi One can't help you with tuning, but one thing it can do is help you offset the CV values so that you can adjust the voltages going out to everything in your setup. So I've got two sequences programmed in here on sequencer 1 and sequencer 2, and they kind of sound like this between the plats and the twin waves. Not quite in tune, they're a little bit off. So how would I bring these back in tune? We go over to the CV gate page and you go to the CV section, and let's just adjust the first oscillator, which is the twin waves. So if I press and hold this tab, now you see here we have this offset amount. I'm just going to offset it ever so slightly by 2 semitones. Now you see, it's a little bit better in tune. You can offset it, and you can offset it down as well, you see. Well, that was one trick that you can use the CV gate outputs for. Another one that we talked about at the start, but I haven't shown you yet, is this envelope mode. And this is where we can generate a kind of attack release envelope, a very simple envelope, using the velocity and the gate length of the outputs of a sequencer. Now, one way you can do this, of course, is just to open up a VCA. But what if we use this to modulate some things? And let's look at it from the point of view of taking sequencer 2 here. I'll just mute the drums. And that's plats over here. And what I want to do is modulate the timbre and the morph. And I'm going to use sequencer 3 for this. Now, why am I doing that? It means I can program in modulation patterns in sequencer 3 and still keep my main melody pattern on sequencer 2 for plats. And that's a really clever way of using sequencers to play off each other. Right, so let's go into sequencer 3. I have it set up with a previous pattern, and I'm not too worried. It's a multi-track pattern here. I'm not too worried about what exactly it's going to be generating, so we're just going to leave it in multi-track mode and clear it. Okay, and then we can set the length of this track, say, to be just 8 steps and program in a couple of triggers there on track number 1 of sequencer 3. Now we want to go over and we're going to map CV output 3 to sequencer 3, and instead of being velocity or note, we're going to have it be trigger envelope. Okay, so the trigger envelope is going to be generated now by the triggers in sequencer 3. Now the velocity of the triggers gives the amplitude of the envelope, and the length of the gate amount. So if I tie those notes, we would get a longer envelope. Let's just take a look here. Now let's patch CV3 into, say, the timbre modulation. And now you see it here hitting there. And of course, I can adjust the speed of sequencer 3 to be a lot slower on this particular track here. Now I can program in another pattern onto track number 2 here of sequencer 3. I can map that now onto the CV4 output there, and I can make sure it's mapped to track 2 in my setup. And now I'm going to take this envelope, which is being generated on CV output 4, and I'm going to use it to modulate the mod parameter here on Ikarie. What I've done is I've patched plats to go through Ikarie into the mixer. And now if we take a listen, there's the melody playing on plats. And here is the modulation envelope. Turn it off, nothing changes. Turn on the bottom one. Throw it all together. Now, it's also possible to use multitrack sequencers as 8 mono sequencers. So let's do that. And we're going to use this top track here to sequence twin waves over there. So we're going to change things around. Instead of sequencing twin waves from CV and gate 1 mapped to sequencer 1, we're now going to do it on sequencer 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now, what we have here is sequencer 3 is sending pitch information to CV1 and gate information, trigger information, to gate number 1. But which track? Remember, I want to use this top track here to sequence twin waves. Which track does this correspond to? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I go up here, and now I have to set this to track 8 over here, and track 8 over here. Otherwise, the wrong trigger and velocity or pitch information will go out. Mute this over here so we won't hear it. Now I can change the note, of course. Now, there we go. We got a very simple bass rhythm going on. And you can go in and use the auto generation feature in here on track 8. For example, we could use the Euclidean pulses. We just mute this other sequencer. And of course, if I wanted to forget about sequencer 2 here, sequencing plats, and just use, say, this line here to sequence plats as well, so I had all of my sequencers under one control, we could go in and do that by, again, doing this, and we'll set this to be track 7. Remember, track 7 corresponds to that one that's second from the top of sequencer, the sequencer here. Well, there's even more ideas of how you can use the CV and gate outputs along with different types of sequencers to really open up the sounds in your modular patches and just kind of really explore new performance techniques as well. The last thing I want to show you is how to use the Oxi One CV gate mapping to map a MIDI controller such as this little Arturia Micro Lab here to CV outputs. So effectively, the Oxi One can act as a MIDI to CV converter. Now, first of all, how do we actually connect the Microlab to the Oxi One? Because the Microlab is a very simple portable keyboard and it just has a single USB-A port. There's no MIDI on the back of the Microlab. Well, what we do is we need a converter like this one I got on Amazon. It's a USB-C to USB-A converter. I just plug that in there like that. And then we plug this in the side of the Oxi One. Now, nothing happens. Why is that? We have to change how the USB port here behaves. By default, the Oxi One is in USB device mode. We want it to become host mode, so we go down into the configuration, scroll down to System, go down to USB, and choose Host plus Power. You see it says Host plus Power here. Now, if you want to know if you have your MIDI device correctly connected, go into the System menu in the configuration, go to MIDI in Monitor, and you see now when we press keys or move our finger on the mod wheel, we get indication here. So now we know it's connected correctly. How do we map the output of this USB keyboard to the input of a sequencer, and from that sequencer out to the modular? So let's take a look at that next. We'll use sequencer 1. And there's two things you need to do. The first thing is you have to make sure that the MIDI channel for that sequencer is the same MIDI channel for your keyboard. So here it's on MIDI channel 1, and I have the sequencer on channel 1. Then we go into the CV gate mapping page, and we set up, just like before, sequencer 1, CV1, gate 1. Now let's patch in for this. We're going to use the Bastl Pizza over here. I'm going to use it in its built-in VCA mode, which is really, really handy for this kind of stuff. So let's test it out now. So straight away, we're able to play notes, which means we can also record notes into the sequencer. So let's go ahead and do that. And the count-in starts, and we go. All right, you're not going to win any awards for listening to that, but you get the general idea. Now, we've programmed in a sequence of notes. Now, what if I want to modulate something using the mod wheel? How would I also map the MIDI from the mod wheel to something in the modular? And the general idea here is that a mod wheel, if we go back into our MIDI monitor, the mod wheel generates MIDI CC, continuous change values. So it's generating CC1, if you see there, on channel 1 from 0 to 127. For this, we use the mod configuration for sequencer 1. And in this particular case, mod wheel is CC value 1, so it corresponds to this controller here. Now, what I have to do is go into my CV gate mapping, and if I set CV2 to be the output from sequencer 1, but instead of sending out, say, an LFO or pitch, we're going to send out the value of mod 1. And the value of mod 1 is whatever comes in from here. Let's take a look using this little illuminated mult here. Watch here. You'll see, as I move my finger, you have to hit play. We get an illuminated value. Let's mult that out to somewhere. We're going to send it into the FM index here. And we can also have a bit of fun and mult that into the filter. Say I wanted to record those modulation values, I can also do that on the mod lanes themselves. If I pressed Shift and the button for mod wheel, I'll just set the end step here to be 64. 64. And now, when I hit record, we'll be able to go into the mod lane and record the modulation. See here now. Well, I hope you found today's video useful. I certainly covered a lot, so feel free to skip around and dive into the chapters that make sense for you and what you're trying to do. By all means, please leave me some questions or comments down below. I love hearing from everyone and try to answer all of your questions. Don't forget to hit the old subscribe button there so you can keep up to date with the channel. And thanks very much for watching. See you next time. Let's bring in a little bit of rhythmic pieces. That's the favorite avocado toast, the drive. It's really, really nice distortion.